What is good, everybody? Welcome back to another episode brought to you by the League FFB. Today, we're going to be going through my Week 8 must-start and must-sit players at the wide receiver and the running back position. As always, we got 8 guys to talk about in today's episode, so let's not waste any more time. Let's hop right into today's video, and let's start with my must-start players. So the first player that I want to talk about in today's video is going to be Jayden Reed of the Green Bay Packers. Now, he gets a matchup this week on the road at the Jacksonville Jaguars. Now, last week, Jayden Reed, he caught 2 of his 4 targets for 10 yards in the Packers' win against the Houston Texans. And although Reed didn't give you the numbers last week and is a little bit banged up at the moment, assuming he is active in this game, it should be a great matchup versus the Jaguars that have currently ranked 30th against the wide receiver position. Not to mention the projected game total in this one is at 49 points, so there should be lots of scoring opportunities for the Packers against a very soft Jaguars defense. Again, this all depends on the fact that Reed is healthy to come game day, but the Packers have continued to manage his practice reps over the last few weeks, and it hasn't really resulted in much of a loss in workload come Sunday, so I feel fairly confident that he is going to be able to suit up here this week. So that being said, Reed should be looking to bounce back here in Week 8, and he is a player that I am going to be starting everywhere that I have him, and if I do start him, I am going to be looking at him as a low-end wide receiver 1. Now, moving on to my next wide receiver, I want to talk about Jaylen Waddle of the Miami Dolphins. Now, he plays against the Arizona Cardinals this week, and Jaylen Waddle, he caught 1 of his 2 targets for 11 receiving yards in Sunday's loss to the Indianapolis Colts. Now, just like Reed, Waddle, he's also dealing with an injury this week, so again, this is contingent on him playing this week, but the matchup should be a good one for him regardless. Arizona is currently ranked 24th against the wide receiver position, and this game has a 45.5 point projected game total, which will be pretty middle of the pack, but the big news in this one, and the reason why I'm confident in playing Waddle, is because it is going to be the return of Tua Tagovailoa. Now, we haven't seen Tua in the lineup since week 2, and the return of Tua would benefit this entire offense as a whole. Put that into perspective, Jaylen Waddle had 150 receiving yards in his first 2 starts this season with Tua at quarterback, and only 119 receiving yards in the 4 games combined that Tua missed so far this year. So assuming he is active on game day, I would be plugging Tua into my lineups as a safe wide receiver 2 with some upside now that Tua is back in this offense. Now let's move on to my must-start running back. I want to talk about Kareem Hunt of the Kansas City Chiefs. He plays on the road at the Las Vegas Raiders, and Kareem Hunt, he carried the ball 22 times for 78 yards and 2 touchdowns in the Chiefs win over the Niners last week. He also caught both of his targets for 5 yards as well. In Las Vegas, they currently rank 24th against the position, giving up an average of 24 fantasy points per game. And the Kansas City Chiefs, they want to rely on this run game as their identity this year, with Rashee Rice out for the remainder of the season, so I expect them to keep feeding Hunt the ball. Hunt has been great this season. He's posted 2 RB1 performances in his first 3 games played, and the game where he didn't finish as an RB1 was in Week 4 versus the Chargers when he was still being worked into the lead running back role. Now, it's very clear that Kareem Hunt is a smash play in the right running back matchups this year, and this is one of those games to me. Not to mention, he also has had some touchdown upside every single week, with 3 touchdowns in his last 2 games combined. Now, I strongly suggest throwing Kareem Hunt into your lineups where you have him, and if you do have him somewhere and you are looking at what you can get from him this week, I think he's going to perform as a low-end running back 1. Now, my last must-start running back, I want to talk about Javonte Williams of the Denver Broncos. He gets a good matchup against the Carolina Panthers this week, and Javonte, he's coming off of his best game of the year, posting 14 carries for 88 yards and 2 touchdowns in last week's win versus the Saints. This matchup against Carolina Panther is way too good to pass up, in my opinion. Carolina, they currently rank dead last against the running back position and is giving up 31.1 fantasy points per game to the position as a whole. Not to mention the Broncos have been using Javonte enough in the receiving game this year to give him some PPR upside in a matchup where the spread is -10 in favor of the Broncos, so the books are projecting a good game script for Javonte in this one as well. Now, Javonte, he had a slow start to the year, and he's picked it up recently. He's finished as an RB2 or better in 2 of his last 3 matchups, and I expect him to continue to do the same this week in a good matchup once again. Now, I'd be throwing him into my lineups in all formats, and if you do, he would be a guy that I'm looking at as a high-end RB2, maybe even flirting with low-end RB1 numbers here in this matchup against the Carolina Panthers. But now that we've talked about the players I'm confident in, let's talk about some players I'm not so confident in, starting with Terry McLaurin of the Washington Commanders. Now, he gets a matchup against the Chicago Bears here this week, and last week McLaurin, he caught all 6 of his targets for 98 receiving yards against the Carolina Panthers. However, this week is going to present a different set of challenges for McLaurin, who is possibly going to be playing in this one without his starting quarterback in Jayden Daniels, and if that is the case, he will be with veteran backup Marcus Mariota instead. Now, McLaurin, he's been very good for fantasy football teams lately, finishing as a wide receiver 2 or better in 5 of his last 7 games, but the potential change at quarterback and the matchup against Jaylen Johnson and the Bears this week is slightly concerning. Chicago has one of the best secondaries in the NFL and has consistently been a top 5 matchup for opposing wide receivers, making it hard for them to produce against the Chicago Bears. Not to mention, they've only given up an average of 22.4 fantasy points per game to the position group as a whole on a week-by-week basis. Now, you can certainly still play Terry McLaurin this week if you need to, and in fact, with all of the wide receiver injuries that we currently have at the moment, you probably still have to play Terry McLaurin. But if I'm plugging him into my lineup, I'm looking at him as a low-end wide receiver 2, maybe even just a high-end wide receiver 3 option in a tough matchup this week versus the Bears. Now, moving on to my other must-sit wide receiver, I'm talking about Diontae Johnson of the Carolina Panthers. Now, last week, Johnson, he caught 1 reception on 3 targets for 17 yards in Sunday's loss to the Commanders, and on paper, that had looked like a smash matchup for Johnson, but he was banged up going into the game, and Andy Dalton, he played horribly, and this resulted in a blowout loss altogether. Now, this week, it doesn't look like the week that things are going to change either. It sounds like Bryce Young is going to get the start for the Panthers this week, and with Young under center early in the year, Diontae wasn't even on fantasy football radars. Now you're going to be going back to that level of quarterback play, and you pair it with the fact that Denver and Pat Surtain are currently the #1 ranked defense against opposing wide receivers, meaning this matchup is going to be horrible all around for Diontae Johnson. And as the cherry on top, you mix that with a low projected game total, and Diontae Johnson becomes a player that I want to avoid at all costs if I can, and I'm not ranking him as anything better than just a flex play in my rankings this week, and that makes him a player that if I can afford to bench him, I will be looking at some other options. But now that we've talked about the wide receivers, let's talk about the running backs. I want to talk about Chase Brown of the Cincinnati Bengals. He gets a matchup this week against the Philadelphia Eagles. Now, Chase Brown, he's coming off of a game here in week 7 where he posted 15 carries for 44 yards, and he added 2 receptions for 9 yards receiving as well. Now, this week's matchup versus Philly, it projects to be a little bit tougher for Chase Brown, as the Eagles currently rank 8th against the running back position, and they're only giving up 16.9 fantasy points per game to the running back room as a whole. Now, this game does have a 48-point projected game total, so the way in which I think that Chase can perform enough for fantasy football teams would be if he gets involved in the receiving game, he catches a lot of passes, and that in itself would make him a decent play. But this is still somewhat a messy backfield with Zach Moss still seeing some work. Now, I think Chase certainly has some better weeks in his future, and his upside could increase tremendously without Zach Moss in the lineup if that does get to a point where they do just phase Zach Moss out completely. But this week just feels like there are a few too many obstacles working against him in your fantasy leagues. However, if you do choose to play Chase Brown in your leagues here this week, I'm only looking at him as an RB3 play and somebody who currently sits outside of my top 25 running backs here on the week. Now, moving on to my last and final must-sit running back, I want to talk about Alexander Mattison of the Las Vegas Raiders. He gets a matchup against the Kansas City Chiefs this week, and Mattison, he's coming off of a week where he carried the ball 23 times for 92 yards, and he added 3 receptions for another 31 receiving yards in a game versus the Rams. Now, Alexander Mattison is undoubtedly the RB1 for the Las Vegas Raiders, but it hasn't necessarily translated to much production overall, and this week's matchup versus Kansas City is nightmare material for Mattison, as Kansas City currently ranks #1 against opposing running backs and is only giving up 12.2 fantasy points per game to the group as a whole. Not to mention the game script in this one is currently 41.5 points, meaning that we project it to be very low scoring, and Kansas City is favored by 10 points as well, meaning that Vegas is projected to be playing from behind for the majority of the day, resulting in a bad game script for Mattison rushing the football. Additionally, when you look at the rushing share of this offense, Mattison is the #1 guy, but he's still only seeing 51.9% of the rushing share and an 8.8% target share in a bad offense, which really does cap his overall ceiling on a week-by-week basis. So I'm all for holding Alexander Mattison, and if you want to have hope for him in the future, sure, that's fine. There's some better matchups on the horizon, but not this week against Kansas City here in week 8. So there you have it, folks. There are 4 must-start and 4 must-sit players as we head into week 8 of the fantasy football season. As always, if you enjoyed the video, make sure you hit the like button. Also, make sure you hit the subscribe button and go join our Discord. Our Discord is free to join, linked in the description. But with all of that out of the way, I will see you guys on our next video. But until then, peace out.